So yeah, good morning everybody again. If you haven't already, please download the material from GitHub there. So the way we'll do this morning is I have some slides. I'm going to go through the slides to talk about some of the concepts. And then I'll switch to Jupyter Notebooks, and we'll use the Jupyter Notebooks that are in this repository. I'll walk through some of them, and then there's small exercises I want you to do. And I'll give you like 10, 20 minutes to work on the exercises, and then we run through the solutions. I also have Mohammed here, which will help me. So if you have any questions, any issues with setup, anything, try to flag down either one of us. So Mohammed will be going around all the time. I will be going around through the exercises. Otherwise, I'll just be talking. If you have questions, also feel free to interrupt me and yeah, ask questions. So we have a bunch of time, so I hope we can answer all of your questions and you get something out of this. So, as was already mentioned, I wrote a book if you want. You can find this online. It goes into much more depth about all the things we're going to talk about today. There's going to be a book signing tomorrow where you can get a couple of those for free at the Columbia stand at the career fair. There's also another book that you can find online by Jake Van der Plas, the Data Science Handbook, which I really recommend, in particular if you're newer to machine learning. Jake's book also goes through like pandas and matplotlib and numpy and all the other things, so it's a little bit more introductory than mine. Also, his book is completely free online, which is also good. So for mine, you have to pay. If you're looking for something a little bit more advanced, I also have a lecture series, or this is basically just a course I gave at Columbia this semester, which you can find online there, and it's like videos of all of the lectures. That requires a bit more math, and it's more advanced than what we're going to do today. But that's all free and online. Okay, let's get started. So what is machine learning? So machine learning is usually defined as extracting knowledge from data. For me, I usually talk mostly about one particular kind of machine learning, which is supervised machine learning. So, which is one of the subtypes. So there's basically three types of machine learning that people talk about, that people use, called supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement. So in supervised learning, usually you have some data set where you have some given inputs and desired outputs. For example, you have people's pictures of people's faces and who they are, and you want to predict from the face who they are. Or let me see, you have emails and you have an annotation whether they're spam or not spam, and then you want to predict for a new email whether it's spam or not. So here in supervised learning, you have a data set, a collection, where you have some given inputs from which you want to predict an output. But you are also to build the model given these outputs that you want. So this is what's most commonly used in practice and what we're going to talk about most of today. There's also two other kinds. So we'll also talk a little bit about unsupervised learning. In unsupervised learning, you're basically just given the data set and you're asked to extract information from this data set. And that's often something like clustering or dimensionality reduction is used for exploratory data analysis most commonly, or to extract some information about, often it's used to extract information from the data set that can then be used in supervised learning. We'll talk about unsupervised learning mostly in the context of preprocessing. Finally, there's reinforcement learning, which we're not going to talk about today at all. Reinforcement learning is about an agent learning from interactions with its environment. That has been used recently pretty famously in winning against the world champion in Go, and now computers are much better at playing Go than humans. And but this is also used in robotics, used somewhat in self-driving cars, but we're not going to talk about this at all. So for us, we'll always start with some given fixed data set, and we want to learn from this data set. And in supervised learning, we have some desired targets associated with the data set, and in unsupervised learning, we don't. If you want to get mathematical about, if you don't, it's fine too, but sort of in math speak, usually what we want in supervised learning is we have some data that we assume comes from some underlying distribution we call P of x and y, where x is some n-dimensional representation, so some feature vector, let's say the pixel intensities in a face, or about the user, how old are they, what's their gender, and so on. And yi is the thing you want to predict. And and usually you want to find a function that, given an xi, so given like information about a face or given information about the user, predicts the yi that you want. So you want to find an f that, given a new xi, a new face, a new email, a new user, predicts the yi that we want. There's two main classes of supervised machine learning problems called classification and regression. And so in classification, y is discrete, meaning y are discrete categories. For example, so this is from my lecture for my class. So example here is y discrete is will you pass or will you not pass? Or will your customer buy the product, will they not buy the product? Or this face belongs to person A, this face belongs to person B, this face belongs to person C. Regression means y is continuous, which means how many points will you get in the exam? Or how much money will this customer spend? Or what should be the price of this item? And so these are sort of the two main problems that we're going to talk about today. And they are very similar, but they usually require slightly different methods. And so one of the core things about supervised learning is that, so you have a data set given as some inputs and desired outputs, and you want to learn the correspondence from how to go from the inputs to the outputs. But the thing is, you don't want to learn this only for data that you already have. Let's say you have a bunch of emails labeled as spam or not spam. You don't only want to predict for the emails that you already labeled whether they're spam or not spam. You want, if you get a new email, you want to be able for a new email to say, is this new email spam or is it not spam? So the point is not only to find this correspondence to go from X to Y on the data set that you already have, but to find an F in such a way that it'll be able to make predictions for new data that you haven't seen. So if you could only learn about the things you already saw, that would be kind of boring. We want to be able to extrapolate to things we don't see. And this is called generalization. And it's sort of the main goal of supervised learning, is to generalize from what we observed during training to new data for which we don't know the true answer. So the tool we're going to use today is mostly going to be scikit-learn, because that's what I'm working on, and also because it's probably the easiest thing to do in Python at least. So scikit-learn is a Python library which comes with tools for all kinds of machine learning. So we're mostly going to look at classification and regression. There's also things for clustering and all kinds of different things. And in addition to the algorithms, there's also tools for tuning the algorithms, tools for evaluating the algorithms, and tools for introspecting the algorithms. So everything that you need around the machine learning process itself to make it work. There's also tools for building more complicated pipeline out of simple parts. And we're going to talk about more how all of this works in a little bit. So I'm one of the core developers, but scikit-learn is actually a big community project. I think this is an outdated slide, but we have right now something like 45 core developers, I think. And we have about 50 people contributing to scikit-learn every month. Okay, so I already said get a notebook, and then we can get started. So most of the coding today will all be done in Jupyter Notebooks. So who here has used Jupyter Notebooks before? Okay, most of you. That's good. Yeah, I might give a very brief introduction at the beginning. So I also want you to check out, while we're doing the exercises, scikit-learn.org. We have pretty extensive documentation, And you can find a lot about the things you might want to ask about, or a lot of information about your algorithms in the documentation. There's two main parts, or there's actually three main parts that are sort of interesting. The user guide is sort of like a narrative. It's a little bit like reading a book that tells you how to do things. So that's sort of the main resource for most people. The API documentation tells you for each function and each class, what does this functional class do, and what are all the parameters. And then the examples, you can see that at the top, very top, there's an examples button that show you, there's a whole gallery of like, I don't know, I'm sure over 100 examples of how to use all of these things. So this will be a very helpful resource for you to do the exercises. Okay, so now let's get a little bit more concrete. So the way scikit-learn works is the data is represented in NumPy arrays, and there are data X, which is sort of the features, which is sort of the information you have about a user, for example, is represented as a 2D NumPy array. We call the data always X in scikit-learn, which is sort of maybe a not very telling shorthand, but it's very short at least. And so each row in this array corresponds to one sample. So let's say one user you want to reason about, one email, just one product. And each column corresponds to one feature. So let's say user's age, or how often they visit your site, or how long they stay. And so the shape of this matrix is always number of samples times number of features. And for supervised tasks, we call the targets usually Y. Again, not very telling, but very short. And this is a one-dimensional vector usually, or at least for us today, will always be a one-dimensional vector or a NumPy array. And this can either be floats here if you do a regression task, or it can be basically something arbitrary when it's a classification task. Usually people use integers as the class labels. So, but you could also have like yes, no, yes, no, yes, no as class labels. And the size of Y is just number of samples. So it's a 1D NumPy array. And all the data we're going to work with is basically going to have this form. If your data doesn't have this form, you need to bring it in this form to work with scikit-learn. So scikit-learn is relatively agnostic of pandas, so you can put pandas data frames into scikit-learn, but it'll just convert them to NumPy arrays. So for various technical reasons, there's nothing smart going on, so you need to always separate the data and the label, so X and Y, in this way. Also, because this are NumPy arrays, their X is homogeneous, so you can see X is all floats. And all algorithms in scikit-learn basically assume that X is all floats, and they're all finite, and there's no missing values. So we'll talk later about how you can get from categorical variables to floats and so on, but for scikit-learn generally, you want all the entries in X should be just floating point numbers. All right, so once we have our data represented, we want to start building our algorithm. As I said before, the goal in building our algorithm is to build an algorithm that not only works on the data we already collected, but it will also work on future data that we haven't seen. And we don't want to just build the algorithm and then hope that it's going to work in the future. If we want to put something in production, hopefully we have some assurance that it's actually going to work. But for the future data, we don't know what the correct answer is. So the standard trick to overcome this is to split your training data, your data set that you collected, into two parts. A training set, which you use to build the model, and the test set, which stands in for future unseen data. So basically, you pretend you don't know the labels for a test set, you make predictions according to your model on the test set, and then you compare it against what you know is true. This way, you get an unbiased estimate of how well your model will do on new unseen data. And if your model does well on a test set, you can assume it also does well on future data, as long as the data is produced by the same process, comes from the same distribution. If your test set is completely different from what your model will see when it's in production, then this will tell you nothing. So before we start building our model, at least in supervised learning, we always split it up into a training set to build the model and a test set for later evaluation. Okay, the question is, how much should you use as training and test set? The default in scikit-learn is, I think, 75-25, but that's not really, that's just a rule of thumb. And there's sort of trade-offs. We're going to talk about a lot of smarter methods to do that, particular cross-validation in a little bit. But people use anything from 50-50 to like 90-10. And the more data you put in the test set, the more accurate your estimate will be of how well you do in the future. The more data you put in your training set, the better your model will be. All right, so now I want to get started with the first notebook just on data loading. You should be able to use Python 2.7 or 3.4, 3.5, 3.6, well, 3.4 or later. If you have any problems, so yeah, for now, Mohammed will help you if you have any issues setting up. Once we go to the exercise, I'll also be wandering around. Okay. Can you all see this in the back? Can you see? Not so good? Yeah, okay. Okay, so just a very, very brief rundown of Jupyter before we get started. So I'm using the Jupyter Notebook. You could also be using Jupyter Lab, which is sort of the next generation thing. I'm usually using Jupyter Lab these days, but I thought you probably are all using Jupyter Notebook, so I'm going to use Jupyter Notebook. So Jupyter works with these cells. So each of these cells, you can put in some piece of code and you can run it. And you can run it either by pressing the run button up here, or what I usually do is press Shift-Enter. If you do either of these, you can see that the cursor automatically goes to the next cell. And if I press Shift-Enter again, it'll run the next cell. And so the way I'm going to be stepping through here is just press Shift-Enter, Shift-Enter, and so on. So the most important thing for a new system, I think, is, oh, yeah. Oh, it's going to be neither of those. I'm going to talk about the data set in a little bit. Let me run through my Jupyter spiel first, okay? Yeah? Yes. Well, all the code runs on 2 and 3. If you build a model and you pickle it, which is storage disk, and load it in the other Python, it will not work. That's a limitation of the Python pickle format. So you cannot build a model on one and put it to the other, usually easily. But you can run the same code on 2 and 3. All right, so the most important thing about any new system, I think, is how to get help. There's a lot of very useful keyboard shortcuts in this. And you can get to the keyboard shortcuts by pressing H. Or you should usually, if you are in a cell and you press H, it'll be just type H. If you click anywhere or press Escape and then type H, it'll show you all the shortcuts. In particular, what's helpful is insert a new cell above or below and run a cell. Or maybe and delete a cell. but there's a lot of shortcuts. So that's about getting help about Jupyter. If you want to get help about any of the code, there's basically two ways to do this. One is go into a function that you're calling, like here a print function, and press Shift-Tab, and it'll show you the doc string. And if you press Shift-Tab again, then it'll show you more, and if you do it once more, it'll open a window with all the documentation. Shift and Tab. So I hold down Shift and then press Tab. And I think you actually, you all need to try this. Hold Shift, press Tab. Hold Shift, press Tab twice. Hold Shift, press Tab 3 times. It's really important because, like, for scikit-learn, you will be able to see all the documentation of all the models, all the parameters, and what all the parameters mean. And this is a very quick way to get help. The other way, if you can't manage the Shift-Tab, which you really should, you can also just do question mark and then run it. And it'll pop up the help as well. You also have autocomplete if you press Tab. So here, if I write pre and I press Tab, it'll autocomplete to print. So this was just a very, very quick rundown of Jupyter and how to get help. So the data set we're actually be loading is a data set that's built into scikit-learn. I'm doing that because that makes things easier. There's nothing special about the data sets in scikit-learn, and they're just NumPy arrays that we can load easily. So here we will load the data set called digits by importing from sklearn the data sets, load digits. If I call load digits, I get these digits object back, which is something like a dictionary that contains data, target names, images, and description. So this format is really not important. This is just sort of how the internal data sets in scikit-learn are stored, but don't worry too much about it. The interesting things are digits.data and digits.target. As I told you, the data matrix is always number of samples times number of features. So this data set has 1,797 rows or samples and 64 columns or features. And the target is one target for each row, so it's also 1,797. Yes. So for the digits, it's like rows and columns. So the rows correspond to samples, and the columns correspond to different features. So, and the targets here are, as you can say, integer numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, you can't see it 3, but you can maybe imagine there might be 3. I can also, like, np.bin count lets me count how much there is of everything, and you can see there's 178 zeros, 182 ones, and so on. So there's 0, 1s, 2, and so on, until 189s in this target vector. Okay, so now let's look at this data. So it's always important to get some idea of what your data actually means. Here, this data is actually very, very low resolution images. So these 84 features are actually 84 pixel intensities in an 8x8 image. 8x8 is like a really low resolution image. So we're going to show this one now. For plotting, we're going to use matplotlib. If you want to show matplotlib stuff in the notebook, you should probably use matplotlib inline or matplotlib notebook magic. So which is %matplotlib and then either inline or notebook. Notebook gives you an interactive Matplotlib plot inline just gives you the picture, but inline works in Jupyter Lab and Jupyter Notebook. The Matplotlib Notebook doesn't work in Jupyter Lab as far as I know. All right, so now what I'm doing is I call matShow on data 0. So this is the first row of the matrix. It's 64 times 64. I reshape it to 8 times 8, and I tell it to use a color map gray. And this is what we get. This is a very low resolution handwritten digit 0. And if we look at the target for this is 0. So the goal here is to predict from this very low resolution image of a number or of a digit, what is the digit? And the digits are 0 to 9. So this is not the MNIST data set, by the way. This is like a very, very tiny, very trivial data set, but it's kind of nice to see what's going on. I'm going to just plot a couple more so you can see what's happening. So here I'm just, so I'm not going to talk too much about the details of Matplotlib as we go along. I find it really helpful to have a good grasp of Matplotlib because I think looking at data is like really, really important. So here I just create an array of 4 times 4 subplots, and then I iterate over the first 16 samples, the data and the targets, and then I plot them. And you can see this is our sort of the first 16 samples. And this is what these look like, together with their labels. And so the important thing here is to sort of try to visualize or like think about how each of these numbers is represented as a 64-dimensional vector. So the 64-dimensional feature vector for the 0, for example, is just the grayscale value here is the first feature, the grayscale value here is the second feature, and so on. All right, so as I said, yeah, just as a reminder that it has always a NumPy array of shape number, samples, times number of features. There's also another input format called sparse matrix that we'll probably go to in the afternoon session. And so to split the data, we can use the train test split function. That's just a simple helper that shuffles the data and then splits it into training test set. As I said, by default, it does 75-25, but you can also give it any other split fraction. If you listen to me on how to get help, then you know you can press Shift-Tab and see the options here. And there's an option test size, which is how much data should be in a test set. But usually it's fine to just use the default of 75-25. So by default, it's 72. So there's test size, the test size parameter, and by default, the test size parameter is 0.25. Yeah, that's the default. So here, if you look at the help again, it should be. Do you want to add an issue that the default value should be in the first line? Can you open an easy issue on this? Thanks. Should say the default value here. Anyway, so you can see that test set size, by default, the value is set to 0.25. So if I do this does nothing. This is exactly the same as if I leave it out, but I can also change it and set it to a different value. Of course, I need to spell it correctly. Test size, damn it. See, I never use this parameter. Okay. And so before, this was our whole data set, 1,797 samples, or images of digits in this case. And so we split it up into 75-25, and so then we have 1,347 rows in the training set and 450 rows in the test set. And of course, we have the same features. These are all still 8 times 8 images. So they're all 64-dimensional. And so this train test split is that it shuffles the data and splits it, like it shuffles consistently the data and the target so that the correspondence between data and target is still the same, and then splits it into X train, Y train, X test, Y test. All right. Maybe one other side note is this is done because of the shuffling. There's like a random component in here. Whenever there's a random component, okay, let me illustrate this. So this is Y test now. If I run this again, it changes because this is done randomly. If I want to control what's happening, I can set the random state by setting random state to a number, for example. This will be used as the random seed for any operations, and this means that whenever I run it, now it'll always have the same result. This is just a side note, but if at any point later your results are different from my results, it's probably because one of us didn't fix the random state, or we didn't fix it to the same value. Okay, so I want you to do the first exercise now, which is load your iris data set from sklearner data sets. So basically do the same as we did with the digits. You can print the description and to figure out more of the data set if you don't know about it. And then you can think about what is the number of classes in this data set. It's a classification data set. What's the number of features? What's the number of data points? And if you know how to use Matplotlib, you can also do a scatter plot to visualize the data set. So this is sort of building, using the built-in data set. If you're adventurous, usually people give you data as a CSV file, or often, if you're unlucky. So after you've done this, you can also try to load it from a CSV file. And so here's a CSV file that contains the data set, and if you want, you can try to load it from there with the read CSV method. But before that, I would like you to just load it using the load iris function. Yeah, and I want to give you like 10 minutes to work on this. Any questions so far? Okay. Oh, and you can load the solution by uncommenting this and running it. Don't do that. You should really try it yourself. All right, let's keep going. So that was just a warm-up. So here, if we load iris, we get back this iris object. I don't think I printed it here, but if you do print iris.desk, you can see this is about the iris plant database, which is about classifying different species of irises. These are the 3 ones, the 3 classes. Here are the 4 attributes: sepal length, sepal width, and petal length, petal width. And if you look at the dataset size, here x.shape0 is the number of samples, the number of features is x.shape1, which is 4, and the number of classes is 3, which is the length of the unique entries in Y. I don't think I asked you to do a train test split, but I just did a train test split for giggles, I guess. And then I did a scatter plot of the 0th feature against the first feature and of the second feature against the third feature. And here you can see the classes are a little bit separated, and here you can see the classes are pretty well separated if you look at dimensions 2 and 3. Questions? Okay. So then let's start with the actual machine learning. So as I said, in supervised machine learning, you have training data and training labels, as we just saw in these examples. And with these together, we built our machine learning model. Once we have the model, we can use it to make predictions on new data that we haven't seen. And we can use the test labels to assess whether the model is any good, so, how well the model will do on future unseen data. And so there's sort of two phases here. There's a training phase where you use the training data to build the model, and there's a generalization phase where you try to apply the model to new data. And so the scikit-learn API very much mirrors these steps. So let's say, so I'm not going to talk about the specific classifiers too much in the morning. I'm going to talk more about them in the afternoon. For now, just accept that there's a thing called a random forest classifier, and it classifies things, usually pretty well. So all the classes or all the algorithms in scikit-learn are implemented as Python classes. So if I want to use a random forest classifier, you instantiate a Python class, random forest classifier, and you get an object called CLF. This CLF object encapsulates both the training algorithm, the prediction algorithm, and it stores the model. So everything you learn from the training data. So I instantiate this object, and then I can call the fit method. The fit method does the training and builds the model. And the arguments to the fit methods are the training data and the training labels. And after calling this fit method, the fit method builds the model and stores it in the CLF object. Then I can use a CLF object to make predictions on any new data set. So for example, on the test set. And the predict method will then return the predictions according to the model. They're called ypred here. To evaluate the model, I could now compare ypred to ytest to see if the predictions are close or identical with the test labels. There's also a convenience function in scikit-learn called score. clf.score will give me, in this case, the accuracy of the model. And the score method gets the data I want to evaluate on and the true labels. So what score will do, it will just call predict on the test set and then compare ytest with the predictions. Yeah?
Why is not one argument the prediction variable there in the score method?
Sorry? Okay.
It should one argument be the prediction, the y underscore thread for the score method.
Oh, so you could, yes, as I said, you could use you could compute the score using ypred and ytest, but the score method does the prediction for you. So you don't actually, if you just want to evaluate, you don't have to run predict. So clf.score runs predict internally. So if you want to just evaluate the model, you can use score. If you actually want the predictions, you can use the predict method. So for classification, it's always using accuracy. For regression, it's always using R-square. There's many more metrics in scikit-learn. These are just, if you call the score method, this is what you will get. We'll also in the afternoon talk about how you can use all the different score methods. Accuracy is often not very good for classification, and you want to do something else like AUC or average precision, something like that. But yeah, so score will be accuracy for classification and R-square for regression. All right, so now let's go to the notebook and actually build our first machine learning model. So I start with the digits data set that we already saw in the last notebook. I call load digits. Then I call the train test split with digits.data, digits.target. I've actually fixed the random state here, so you get the same result as me. So here my training set is now, as before, 1,347 rows with 64 columns. And so this is the distribution of the targets in the training data set. So for classification problems, often you want to make sure the distribution of the targets in the training and the test set is the same. So you don't want like all the ones to go in the training set and all the twos to go in the test set or something like that. If you do this randomly, it's very unlikely that that happens. But you can actually also prevent this from happening, like explicitly, if you say stratify. This will make sure that the distribution of the targets is the same in training and test set. It's not very important here, but if you have very imbalanced data sets, let's say only 0.01% of your data is class A, the rest is class B, then you want to make sure that the ratios are the same in training and test set, otherwise the metrics will make no sense. So if you do this, then you get more balanced outcome. Here it really doesn't matter so much. All right, so now let's build a model. So the API is really simple and it's really the same for everything. So you always import your model first that you want to use. So here I'm using a model called linear SVC. It's just a linear SVM. It's a linear classifier. So I instantiate the object, and this is where I could set parameters. All machine learning models have some, or nearly all machine learning models have some parameters you need to adjust, or you probably should adjust to build a model. Here I don't set any parameters, but this instantiation is where you would set them. For example, this has a regularization parameter C, and so I could set C to some value here. Then I fit the model. So everything, wow, that's interesting. Anyway, so any model in scikit-learn has a fit method, and all the supervised ones have a fit method that gets the data and the target. Maybe I should have used the default C. Wow, that's weird. Someone, anyway. Yeah, this is in a development version. Someone messed something up. That's really interesting. Let me make a quick note of that. Yeah. Okay, so after you build the model, so it will be stored in SVM. And then you can use SVM predict. Here I do the predictions on the training data set. And as you can see on the training data set xtrain, the predictions look very much like ytrain. So it basically learned to make the predictions on this data set. As I said before, so I can also use the score method. The score method tells me I'm 99.3% accurate. So on 99.3% of the samples in this training data set, I predicted the correct digit. What we're really interested in, though, is how well does this model generalize. And so now I can look at the test set, which I didn't see during training, and see how accurate is it on the test set. And you can see here it's 94.6% accurate on the test set. And so this API is the same for all supervised models in scikit-learn, and it's mostly the same for all models in scikit-learn. So if you now want to use something else, like a random forest classifier, we can import the random forest classifier. We can instantiate it. Here I set the number of estimators, which is the number of trees in the random forest, to 50. I fit the model on the training data set, and then I compute the score on the test data set. And you can see it's 97.1% accurate. And so you can see it's like slightly better than the SVM in this case. Okay, so I mean, there's not a lot to go through. I just want you to go through this yourself again. So here, we load the iris data set. We have the data X. We have the targets Y. We do a train test split. We instantiate the k-neighbors classifier model. The one parameter here is the number of neighbors. And by default, it's 5. You could have left it at the default or tried to change it. And then we fit it on a training set, and we evaluate it on a test set. We could also evaluate it on a training set to see what happens there. Yeah, that's also interesting. Sorry, I didn't get your question. Okay, so we're going to go through these algorithms, actually not in the afternoon, but in like an hour or something. So for now, I just want to look at the API, and we're going to look at about how the models work in a bit. Also, the iris data set is tiny and very easy. Don't take any results on this data set, or probably any of the data sets we're doing today, serious. So this is all sort of mostly toy data. Later, okay, we will maybe look at the adult data set, which is a little bit more interesting. Oh, also, before we go on, does anyone know if there's a coffee break at some point? I decide? No, I'm pretty sure they decide, because at some point coffee will be served. 10:30? Okay, cool. Thanks. Okay, so we just saw the API for supervised learning. Now I want to briefly go to the API of unsupervised learning. Really what you use in practice is mostly supervised learning, but actually the method for unsupervised learning is very similar to what we use for preprocessing and scikit-learn, and so that's quite important. So in unsupervised machine learning, usually so you just have some data. It can be, you can split your data and train test data, but that's not even necessary because there's often no evaluation. So you just have some data and you build a model. And often in unsupervised learning, that's all you do. And then you look at the model and see what it tells you about the data. Some of the models, like principal component analysis, for example, allow you to get a new view, a new representation of the data. So then, given this model, say the principal components, you can transform the training data, or you can transform any new data, like the test data. And this is what I call an unsupervised transformation. And this is sort of also the way a lot of the preprocessing methods in scikit-learn are phrased. The way this works, so if you don't know what PCA is, don't worry too much about it. But it's just a transformation of the data that allows you to reduce the dimensionality if you want. And so, again, I instantiate the object. If I want to set any parameters, like the number of principal components I want to extract, I can do this here. Then I do pca.fit on either just the whole data or the training data set. It's an unsupervised method, so there's no y here, so we call fit just on xtrain. Then if I want to transform data, I call the transform method. And so here, transform of xtest returns a new representation, a new x representation of a test data set that I call xnew here. So let's walk through that. So this is notebook 2 unsupervised transformations. So actually, what I'm going to do here is not do PCA, but do something much, much simpler, which is removing mean and scaling the variance of the data. For many of the models, like some of the linear models and the SVMs and so on, and neural networks, it's important that the data that all the features are sort of on the same scale. And so one of the easiest ways to do this is removing the mean and scaling the variance. And that's implemented as one of these unsupervised transformations. The thing that does that is the standard scaler. So we can instantiate the standard scaler. We can fit it on a training data set. And then we can transform, for example, a training data set. So if I do X train scaled, this is now a scaled version of the training data set. It has exactly the same shape, has the same number of samples, same number of features, but now it has the mean removed. So here's the mean on the training data set. Here's the mean on the scaled training data set. And it's 0 because we subtracted it. I can also look at the standard deviation, and the standard deviation is 1 everywhere. You can see there's a couple of zeros. That's because these features are actually constant. So they're like the corners of the image are always white. And so that's why I think it's the corners, and so that's why you see 4 zeros in here. So there's 4 pixels that have no variance at all, and so they can't be scaled to have variance 1, so they stay at 0. Now we can transform the test set, scale the test set. So this is often used as a pre-processing method for supervised learning tasks. So that's why I scaled into training and or split it into training and test set. Okay, so if I do this is the transform test set, and can compute the mean of that. What do you think is the result of this? Any guesses? No? No guesses? Okay, so some said 0. The point is it's not 0. So we're transforming it here using what we estimated on the training data set. So the fit was on the training data set. The fit here, up here, is computing the mean and standard deviation of the training data set. And now I use the same mean and standard deviation of the training data set to transform the test set. But because they're not the same data set, they're just from the same distribution, they have slightly different means and slightly different standard deviations. So if I subtract the mean and divide by the standard deviation, then this will not have mean 0. But it's important that you apply the exact same transformation to training and test set, otherwise the model will not really make sense. So this API actually gives me a nice way to transform the data in a consistent way and make sure that I do the right thing. Question is it always good practice to standardize your data? Depends on the model. So all tree-based models don't care. All the other models mostly care. And there's different types of scaling. I'm not sure if I have the figure here, but there's a figure in my book about how different scalars work. So standard scalar is pretty good. If you have large outliers, there's robust scalar that deals better with outliers. If your 0 and your 1 means something, in this data set, for example, 0 means white and 1 means black. So it's a bimodal distribution. It's not really Gaussian at all. Then the min-max scalar might be more sensible, which scales everything between 0 and 1. Or minus 1 and 1 if you want that. But yeah, all models that are not tree-based care about the scaling of the data, basically. Tree-based models don't, everything else does. All right, so now for a different transformation. Question?
Is there a reason why you would prefer the scalar function to the scale function? Like the actual the sort of standard scalar to the pre-processing scale function?
Yes. So the question is, why do I use the standard scalar object and not just a scale function, which is also in scikit-learn, which just scales the data? The point is just exactly this here, which is I want to scale the test set using the mean of the training set. So when I learn, I want to build my model only on the training set. This is part of the learning. Even if it's just subtracting the mean, I'm extracting some statistics from this data, the mean, and I only want to ever extract anything from the training set. So that means I shouldn't scale the data before I split it. I should split it first and then scale it. Actually, for scaling in practice, it might not make that big a difference, but it's like, conceptually, it's good practice to only ever extract information from the training set into your model. So you should need to split it first, and then you need to scale it. Then you need to scale the training and the test set in a consistent way. And I can only do that with the object. I can't do that with the scale function. But good question. Okay, so I'm gonna now do a different transformation, principal component analysis, which is like a more interesting transformation than just doing scaling the data. So this allows you to reduce the dimensionality of your model by linear projection. I usually like to reduce the dimensionality, or sorry, not the dimensionality of your model, the dimensionality of your data by a linear projection. I like to do that, in particular to project to 2 dimensions, because my monitor or projector is usually 2-dimensional, and then I can do a scatter plot of my data, which I think is often nice. And so here I do PCA with number of components equal to 2, means it's gonna extract the 2 principal components. This is like, maybe as a 2-sentence summary, for those that don't know what principal component is, it tries to find the directions of maximum variance in the data. So these are the 2 directions of maximum variance in the data. So PCA.fit, again, builds the model. Here I didn't do a train test split. I just used the whole data set to get the principal components. Now I transform the data, and I reduce the dimensionality via linear projection from 64 dimensions to 2 dimensions. And now I can do, can visualize this and see, like, so this is a projection of the 64-dimensional digit space into a 2-dimensional space. So each dot here represents a 64 by 64 image, and they're colored according to the classes. And so the one axis is the one principal component, the other axis is the other principal component. And you can see that if you look at the images, it's very hard to see how well these would be separated. In particular, I can't look at 1,700 images at once. So here I'm looking at all the 1,700 images at once as a scatter plot. And so it's, I project it down from 64 to 2, so I throw away a lot of information, but I can see even after I throw away a lot of the information, some of the classes are very well separated. For example, the blue here and the pink here and the purple here, they're very well separated. And others overlap more. But they might not overlap in the original space. So I want to do like a brief transgression to manifold learning, which is another interesting unsupervised learning method. It's not really used that much in practice, but it's kind of fun for visualization. Manifold learning techniques try to project high-dimensional data down to 2 dimensions just for visualization. PCA is useful in many different situations. Manifold learning is just for visualization, and it usually cannot transform new data. So I just want to give you a brief example of this and then have you run an exercise on this. So here I'm going to use the isomap, which is a classical manifold learning technique. And because the manifold learning algorithms don't allow you to transform test data or transform any new data, they don't have a transform method. So if you want to transform the data, what you need to do is do fit_transform. This does the fitting of the model and the transformation in one step. So this API ensures that the thing that you're transforming is the same thing you built the model from. It takes a couple of seconds. And so now if I plot this, so these manifold learning methods always go to 2 dimensions, usually because they're for visualization. And you can see here now that it actually separates these 2 classes as well as it did before, but the other classes are like less overlapping. But now these x and y axes don't really mean anything anymore because it did some like nonlinear mapping. It's kind of not easy to conceptualize. So saying what the x and y axes mean here is kind of hard. But it might still give you some idea of like which classes lie close together, which points are weird. Like this is probably a weird, whatever blue is, probably blue is 0. So this is a weird 0 here because it looks more like the purple. So I want you to do the same kind of visualization, but using the t-SNE algorithm, which stands for t-stochastic nearest neighbor embedding. No, t-stochastic neighbors embedding. Yeah, on this digits data set, and then do the 2D scatter plot. And then we have a coffee break, and then we get back here at, let's say, 11:45, so 10:45. Or questions so far? T-stochastic neighbors embedding, I think. You can also just Google it if you have internet. Does anyone know the Wi-Fi? Wait, there's no Wi-Fi? Okay, there, sweet. Yeah. T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, I was right, yes. All right, so the grace period is over, and we're gonna start now. So this is the solution to the last exercise. Here I just imported t-SNE from the manifold module, the t-stochastic neighbors embedding, and I call fit transform on it. I get
class starting.
What was that? I get x t-SNE back, which is some transformation into 2 dimensions, and I plot it here. So when I first saw this with t-SNE, I was very impressed because so this algorithm is completely unsupervised, but it was able to basically perfectly group the different classes. You can see the blue and the red and the orange are slightly spread out, but it mostly perfectly grouped the classes without using the information that there's classes at all, or that there's 10 classes, or what is digits. So without any information, it was able to group the data in this way. And this can be quite helpful because it allows you to see some of the structure of the data. For example, you can look at the orange ones. I think the orange ones are the 7s. Unfortunately, I don't have them labeled. And you can see, why are they split up? And it's like the 7s with a dash across and the 7s without the dash across, or something like that. And so you can see subgroups of the data. Or there's at some point there's the 9s and the 9s with a hook at the bottom or not. And they're grouped together. And so you can see that you have this quite interesting grouping of the data that allows you to explore what's happening. So this is really good for, or often it's good for exploratory data analysis. I would not use this for preprocessing for a supervised task. If you run a classifier on this now, it's probably going to be worse than running a classifier on the original data. So good for pictures, not so good for classification. Yeah, people have run this on text analytics, and they made many pictures that they put in their papers. It's very good if you write papers. You should always put a t-SNE picture in there.
What do you recommend for dimensionality reduction for learning? Something like a PCA where you get the number of components to display a certain fraction of the variance, or what is the recommendation?
The question is, what is the recommendation for dimensionality reduction for learning? My recommendation is don't do dimensionality reduction for learning. Usually, unless you have to. If you need to make it faster, you need to compress it for some reason, or maybe you need to make it more interpretable, then you can drop some features. But generally, the model is the thing that knows best what is going to be helpful for prediction in this model. So I would just give the model as much information as possible and then have it figure it out. But at least in general, like sometimes you might find PCA for dimensionality reduction helps, but in general, it's not really what I would do. In general, I would just give everything to the model. But we're going to talk more about some of these things in a little bit. Yeah, but also this data set is very simple, so this is why it works so nicely. If the data set's much harder, it might not work so nicely. But I've still found like throwing something into t-SNE sometimes might give you like an insightful picture. And similarly, throwing your data into PCA might give you an insightful picture. Yeah, the problem with t-SNE again is these two axes have no meaning. Like locally, things that are together are similar, but like going from left to right here has no meaning in the input space. There's no interpretation for this. All right. So let's move on. So we saw the API being mostly, we have fit for everything, and then we have predict and transform. And so someone asked me, so do we do predict for supervised learning and transform for unsupervised learning? But it's not entirely like that. So everything has fit, and everything gets an X, and if it's a supervised learning algorithm, it also gets a Y. And you use predict whenever you want to predict like a single vector outcome, like in classification, regression, but it's also used in clustering, which is unsupervised. We're not going to talk about clustering today. But this is when you use the predict method. Use the transform method whenever you want to have a new representation of the data. Often that's unsupervised, as we saw just now, with preprocessing or dimensionality reduction. It can also be used for things like feature selection, which is often supervised. So transform is for getting a new representation of the data. Predict is getting for some form of prediction, something that looks like a Y. But these are really the three core methods in scikit-learn. This is really the core API that you need to memorize. Fit, predict, transform are the three methods. So the next thing I want to talk about is going into a little bit more detail about some of the algorithms so that you have some idea, at least, of what's happening behind the scenes. So I want to start with really the simplest classifier possible, which is the nearest neighbor classifier. Which you maybe used in one of your examples. It's called k-neighbors classifier in scikit-learn. So here, this is sort of a scatter plot of data. I'm going to show a lot of plots like these, where you have like a two-dimensional data set, one feature on the x-axis, the other feature on the y-axis, and it's a classification task where the class label are indicated by color, so we want to classify the red points versus the blue points. And so we want to learn something that can distinguish the red from the blue. I'm going to use a lot of these 2D data sets because the screen is 2D. In the real world, you don't have 2D data sets, and you'll never able to actually look at your data in such a simple way. I'm using these 2D data sets where we can look at it so we can see what the algorithms are doing. Okay, so the nearest neighbor classifier, let's say I want to make predictions for these black stars here, and here. And so you want to build a model that can predict, should these be red or should these be blue? In general, if you look at this, you might think, okay, at the top left, it's more blue. At the bottom right, it's more red. But in the middle, it's like a little bit uncertain. But we want to build a model that can make some reasonable predictions. What the nearest neighbor classifier does is it just looks at the nearest data point in the training set and uses that label. So here, for the one in the middle, the closest data point is a red one, and so it's labeled as red. Here's the blue one, here's the blue one. So this is sort of the most simple machine learning algorithm that you can think of. But this is like a valid classifier. You can use it to classify new data. You can make this a little bit more robust by looking at more neighbors. So instead of using one neighbor, we can use 3 neighbors and have them vote what the class should be. So here, when I made this figure, I didn't construct it, but they actually all switched the label when going from one neighbor to three neighbors. So you can see here now the three nearest neighbors have two blue and one red, so the model would classify it as blue. Here it's one blue and two red, so the model would classify it as red, and this one is red as well. And so this is a very simple model, but already you can see there's like this parameter you need to adjust, or the parameter that you need to specify to build a model, which is how many neighbors do I want to look at? And there's no like universal answer to this. So here's the results for several different settings. Now, this is sort of a different kind of graph where I'm trying to visualize the decision boundaries of the classifier. I'm also going to use a bunch of these in these talks. So here, I'm showing the training data set, again, the blue versus the red points. And now I'm showing for the model with one neighbor, for every point in the plane, what would be a point at this point be classified as? So if the background is blue, a point here would be classified as blue. If the background is red, a point here would be classified as red. So I can show you what, like basically the whole thing that the classifier does. And so here for one nearest neighbor, you can see there's like, as you would expect, a little island of the color of the point around each point, because here this is where this point, the red point, is the nearest point. Here, this is everywhere where this blue point is the nearest point, so they have a little area around them. If you look at more neighbors, so here there's 5 neighbors, you can see that sort of this here now doesn't have any area around it anymore because it's sort of far away from all the red points. Here we have these points don't have as much influence anymore. Everything is red here. And the more neighbors we use, basically, the more it becomes like just a flat line that is maybe sort of the general direction. So here with neighbors equal to 1, you have a very fine-grained thing that looks at every individual point. With neighbors equal to 30, which might be the whole data set, I'm not sure, you have something that's like much more smooth in a way. And this is a pretty standard example of what happens with many machine learning algorithms. You have some tuning knob that allows you to say how much power you want to give the classifier. How wiggly do you want the line to be that separates one class from the other? So here, the most complicated one is the n neighbors equal to 1. So you can see here, it has all these like jagged edges, and it tries really hard to fit well on the training data set that we have. Whereas if you increase the neighbors here, you get something that is sort of much more smooth. It misclassifies actually a lot on the training set. So these points here in the training set would all be misclassified. But it's basically, even though you're using more data points, 30, it gives you a simpler explanation of what's happening. It says, okay, well, we have a sort of horizontal line here, and the things below are red, and the things above are blue, which is a simpler explanation than this very complicated shape we have for n neighbors equal to 1. And here is, on this very small toy data set, so it's a very noisy graph, what for different numbers of neighbors the training and test score are. So the training score is very high if you look at very few neighbors, so at one neighbor is actually perfect. And the more you increase the neighbors, the more it goes down, because it smooths out more and more the decision boundary, and so it misclassifies more and more training points. On the test set, it's not very good if you look at very few neighbors, but if you look at more and more neighbors, at some point there's a sweet spot where it works best, and then if you look at too many neighbors, it degrades again. And this is a very noisy graph here, but this is actually something that is a very common pattern for machine learning. And so I basically drew it again as a cartoon image of this to explain what's happening. This is now actually flipped because now I put model complexity on the x-axis and accuracy on the y-axis. So here, this was accuracy on the y-axis, and so here are very complex models. One neighbor is very jagged edges, and here's simple models. 30 neighbors was a pretty straight line. Okay, I now flip this, so now simple models are on the left, complex models are on the right. So on the training set, the more degrees of freedom I allow my model, the more complex I allow my model to be, the better I will be. If my model is way too simple, like the simplest model says it's always class A, then I'm doing very bad on the training data set. If I allow my model to have as much freedom as it wants, I'll be able to do perfect on the training data set, usually, depending on the kind of model I'm using. But if I look at the test set or at generalization, so how will it perform on new data I didn't see? Well, usually it will perform worse than on the training set. So so it's always upper bounded by the training set, basically. So if you have very bad training accuracy, you also have very bad generalization accuracy. If the model is way too simple to capture the training set, you won't be able to make good predictions. If you increase the capacity of the model, if you increase how complex you allow the model to be, then the training set gets better, and the generalization accuracy also gets better. But there's a widening gap between how well the model does on the training and on the test data set. And so at some point, the gap will be so wide that actually the performance on the test set decreases again. This is called overfitting. Overfitting is basically using a model that's too complex for the data that you have. It's basically learning the training set by heart, learning the noise in the training set by heart, and this knowledge will not transfer anymore to the test set. So you're picking a too complex explanation of the data that will not generalize. On the opposite hand, we have underfitting, which is basically your model is too simple to capture the information that's in the data. And somewhere in between there's a sweet spot. And usually you want to adjust the parameters of the model to find a sweet spot. And usually there's more than one parameter, but this is generally how model complexity works. Okay, the question is, how do I measure model complexity? So I don't want to measure model complexity. It's more of a concept. And so for the nearest neighbors, few neighbors meant a more complex model. I mean, there's theory how you can model a complex model like VC dimension or something, but it's not really, I'm not really talking about the theory. Yeah, you mentioned layers, so for a neural network, more layers, bigger layers would be more complex model. For trees, deeper trees are more complex models. So for each model, there's a different parameter that you can tune or that you can set that allows you to control where do you want to be on this line. So for each family of models, like neural networks or tree-based models or linear models, there's some things that you can specify to say, do I want a very simple model or do I want a very complicated model? And if you do a very complicated model, you're likely to overfit. If you do a very simple model, you're likely to underfit. And you should understand the difference between these two. Because in both cases, you're doing like bad on the test data set, but for different reasons. And so understanding where you are on this trade-off will allow you to adjust your model. Like, in this case of neural networks, like, do I need to add more layers or do I need to add less layers? But this is general. This is true for all machine learning models, basically. Okay, so the question is, how do you do this, right? Yeah, so can you have a tool that tells you what the best model is? There's open research on that, but we're going to talk about how this is usually done in practice right now. Yeah. Yes, so we're going to do that. So the easiest way to do this is, okay, the main thing is, okay, how do you do this? The main solution is try them all out. So you just try many, many different models, and you see which one performs well. If you want to do that, though, you shouldn't try them out on the test set. The problem is, if you try out many models on the test set, you will do what's called multiple hypothesis testing error. Some of them will be better just by chance. And then if you use the same test set to evaluate your model, you will think you're much better than you actually are, because you tried too many models. The test set really only gives you an unbiased estimate of how good you are if you use it only once. If you use it multiple times and look at the best model of all the times you tried, it'll be too optimistic. So what people do instead is they split their data up off more. So you use the training set for building the model, a validation set for parameter selection, and then a test set to evaluate your generalization performance. So this is, or at least this is the simplest way to do it. So you build your model using a training set, using many different parameters. You check on the validation set which one of those is best, and the one that's best you use on the test set, and the test set will tell you it's actually 99% accurate or something like that, if you're lucky. So this is sort of the most simple strategy, using 3 sets. It's simple and fast, but it's also high variance, means it depends a lot on how you split the data into training and validation set. Like if you're unlucky and all the hard samples are in the training set and all the easy samples are in the validation set, you'll get weird results. Also, it's a bit of a bad use of data because your training set gets kind of pretty small, because now you have to split up not only the test set, you also have to split up the validation set, which is even more data you're not using. So here's a brief implementation of what this might look like. So this is doing this for a k-nearest neighbor classifier. So here I make an empty list of validation scores. I say, okay, try neighbors from 1 to 15 in steps of 2. Iterate over all the neighbors. So I split before doing this, I split the data into 3 parts. I set the neighbors equal to I, fit it on the training set, and compute the score in the validation set. I do this for all from 1 to 15. Then I can look at the maximum validation score, which is this, 97.2%. And I can look at what's the best setting of the, so argmax is the index of the best validation score, and I could look at which neighbor gave me this best validation score, and its number of neighbors equal to 3. So now I know 3 is a good parameter setting according to sort of trying them all out on the validation set. I could just use the model I built for a neighbors equal to 3, but usually models get better if I add more training data. So instead of just using the model I trained on a training set, I'm going to use a new model that I trained both on the training and the validation set together. So I say, okay, I found out 3 is good, so now I train a new k-neighbors classifier here with n neighbors equal to 3, and I train it on the training set together with the validation set, so I have more data. And then I evaluate it on the test set, only once. And then you can see that, okay, I'm 96.5% accurate. So the reason why you need this test set is, as I said before, this estimate here might be too optimistic. In this case, this is a very small data set, so everything we see is just noise, probably. But in general, because I did the maximum of many different tries, the best validation score will be too optimistic an estimate for how I will perform in the future. And usually you want a good estimate of how I'm going to perform in the future. You don't want to tell your boss, I'm good 99% of the time, and in reality you're only 90% of the time you're correct. Questions about this methodology? Okay. So basically we're just trying everything out on the validation set. The alternative to this is cross-validation. In cross-validation, we do not split our data into training and validation once, but many times. Here's an image for 5-fold cross-validation, where we split the data into 5 equally sized parts that are called folds. So let's say, so this is sort of the representation of my data set again. I split it into 5 equally sized parts. On my first iteration, I hold out the first part as the test set or validation set in this case, and use the folds 2 to 5 as a training set. I use this to compute my validation score, and I store the score. Then I declare the second fold the validation fold, and the other fold the training data. And I train a model on training data, evaluate it on the validation fold, and store this number. And I do this again and again and again. So now I built 5 models, and I got 5 different numbers for accuracy or whatever I was measuring. So this is more stable because now instead of just looking at a single split, I looked at 5 splits. I also can potentially use more data because if I use, instead of 5, I do 10, then I will use 90% of the data for each iteration, which gives me a bigger training set. It also means each data point was in a test set or in a validation set exactly once. So this gives me a much more robust estimate. Usually I want to look like at the mean and maybe at the standard deviation of this score. So I look at all my 5 scores and look at the mean score. This will give me a better estimate than just looking at a single split. The main con of this, obviously, it's slower. So here this is 5 times slower. If I do 5-fold cross-validation, if I do 10-fold cross-validation, it's 10 times slower. 5 and 10 are sort of the most typical values. The default in scikit-learn is 3, which is maybe not a good default. But like 5 or 10 are pretty standard values. So this is just, this is for evaluate. So the question is, how do I find the parameters with this then? So this is for evaluating a single model. I'm going to show you the code in a second. This gives me a single number for a single parameter setting. It gives me the mean cross-validation accuracy over all these folds for a given parameter setting. And then I take the best one of these. No, I'm for each of the 5 models, I compute accuracy. I average the accuracy. I have one number. I have one number for one parameter set. I take the parameter setting that gave me the best number. Yes. No. So these are, yes, I retrain my model. So this will not give me a model to apply. This will give me a parameter setting. I can then, as I did before, retrain my model on the whole training set with the parameter setting I have. So here's a schematic of how the whole process works. So you start with your whole data set. You have your training data set and your test data set. So usually I do a single split of these. Then I use cross-validation on the training data set to find the parameters. And then I do a final evaluation on the test set. So here, basically, I replaced the inner split into training and validation data with the cross-validation. I could also replace the outer split into training and test data with cross-validation. This would result in nested cross-validation, which would be possibly more accurate, but even slower. So this is sort of a scheme that's in the middle between doing nested cross-validation, which is many, many for loops, and doing just a split into 3 parts. If you want to do deep learning, you probably don't want to do this because training a model takes forever, and so then you want to do only train validation and test. And so you do only a single final evaluation here in the test data, and that will tell you how well you expect your model to generalize. Here's sort of an implementation of what goes on. Hopefully this explains this a little bit more. So the cross-val score method does cross-validation for you. Sorry, it's a function. So here I do a train test split to x and y. I look at cross-val scores. I iterate over all the possible neighbor, values for nearest neighbor. For each of them, I call cross-val score with the model, the training and validation set, and I say do tenfold cross-validation. Then I record the cross-validation score as the mean of all the scores over the folds. Then I can look at the maximum again, which is 0.927. And the argmax, again, this tells me number of neighbors is 3. And then once I found the number of neighbors is 3, I can do I can retrain a classifier now on the whole training set. Sorry, this should probably have been X train here. Yeah. So I retrain the model on the whole training set with the best parameters I found, and then I compute the accuracy on the test set. So this is sort of how this works in principle. Because this is so very common, there's tools in scikit-learn to make this easier. But questions about how this works? Okay, so the question is, okay, I think there's like multiple parts to this question. The question is, for the outer thing, you just want to do the single split, and I think that's usually reasonable. So the way I did it here, I didn't fix the random state, so every time I ran this, it will be a different split. So the scenario was, okay, I figure out that I need to drop a feature. So actually what you should do is you should figure out that you want to drop a feature before you look at the test set. So the best thing to do is do all the things that you want to do with the model, all the engineering before you look at the test set, just using the cross-validation score. Only then will the test set actually give you an unbiased estimate. Okay, in the real world, maybe you put it into production, and then a while later you found out, oh, I really need to drop this feature, or I really need to change X and Y. If you want the scores to be comparable, you should use the same split. If you don't care if the scores are comparable of before and after the change, it doesn't matter. But yeah, if you you looked at your test data set twice, which is probably not too bad, but you also might be sort of overfitting the test set by looking at it too often. Okay, so here's another schematic of what's happening in this code. I find it kind of interesting the code is nearly shorter than the schematic of drawing what's happening. So that's why I put Python code up there, because it's about as short as pseudocode, only it's like you can actually run it. So you start with your data set and the parameter grid. So here we had just one parameter, but in practice you can have multiple parameters for your model. And if you have multiple parameters, usually you want to try out all possible combinations of the parameters, which gives you like a big grid of parameters. It also means if you have many parameters, the space of parameters that you're trying will be very big. You split the data set into training and test set. Then you use the training set with cross-validation to find the best parameter from your candidate parameters in your parameter grid. Then you use the whole training data, build the model with the best parameters, and do a final evaluation on the test set. It tells you how good will this model be once I put it into production. And so this is sort of the standard workflow that I preach, at least, and I think that's relatively standard. And so now let's look at how we can actually do this with scikit-learn. So because it's actually much easier than implementing it yourself. So here, just to look at the cross-vault score again. So I'm loading the digits data set, split into train test data set, and now I import cross-vault score and k-neighbors classifier. And if I run cross-vault score with CV equal to 5, it will just give me 5 accuracy values because it does 5-fold cross-validation internally. If I do 10, it will give me 10 accuracy values. What scikit-learn does internally, actually, in this cross-validation is, it doesn't use standard k-fold cross-validation, but it uses stratified k-fold cross-validation. What this means is, as I mentioned before with the train test split, it tries to make sure that the proportion, or the relative proportion of the classes is the same in each of the folds. If you want to use standard k-fold cross-validation, not stratified k-fold cross-validation, or any other kind of cross-validation, there's many different cross-validation iterators in scikit-learn in the model selection module. You can look at the docs. And instead of giving CV equal to a number, you can also get CV equal to, and then some cross-validation object. One particular thing is that cross-validation scikit-learn doesn't shuffle by default. So if I do this here, it'll give me the same result every time, which for some people might be surprising. So if I want to shuffle, if I want cross-validation to use different folds, I need to shuffle the data, and then I can use this cross-validation iterator, and I can tell it, okay, I want a k-fold cross-validation, I want 10 splits, I want it to shuffle, and here I also fixed the random state. So if I change the random state now, it'll shuffle the data in a different way, and I'll get a different result. But yeah, you should be slightly careful with this, because not shuffling the data means that if your data is sorted, your cross-validation results will be really weird. The stratification fixes it a little bit, but if you do regression, we don't stratify by default. And so if you do regression and your data is sorted by the target, and you do cross-validation, it'll just give you garbage. Because you need to shuffle the data. So if you call train test split actually shuffled the data before. But if you didn't use train test split, then your data might be sorted in some way. So you need to be careful about that. All right, so that's cross-validation. So how can we use this for adjusting to parameters? That's done with the grid search CV model. So here I'm now actually going to use a different classifier, which is one that has 2 parameters. This is a kernel support vector machine called SVC. If you don't know what it is, don't worry about it. Important part is it has 2 parameters you usually want to tune. They're called C and gamma. So the first thing we need to do to use this grid search CV is define the parameter grid. It's defined as a dictionary where the keys are the parameters' names, and the values are the values I want to try. So here, this is what I get. So for these particular parameters, it's good to search them on an exponential range. So I have a dictionary where one key is C, and an array of these values is the values, and then I have gamma, and I have these values. And so now grid search will try out all possible combination of these 2 values. And so grid search CV is pretty neat because it behaves just like any other classifier. So all the models in scikit-learn, we call them estimators. So that's all the classes. Grid search CV is what we call a meta-estimator, which means it takes in a model, and it builds a new model. So here it takes in this SVC, which is a classifier, a parameter grid. I tell it to be verbose, and I tell it to be 5-fold cross-validation. This here, as you might see, this is just an instantiation of a new model. So now I have this grid search thing. This grid search object behaves like any scikit-learn model. So this didn't do anything. This just instantiated the model. But now I can call fit on the training set, and this fit now runs the grid search with the cross-validation. It will find the best parameters, and then it will retrain a model on the whole training data set with the best parameters. So basically, nearly everything in this flowchart is done in this line. And, that could take time to run, because now here I have 6 values each, I think. No, 5 times 6. So I have 30 different parameter values. I do 5-fold cross-validation, which means I train 150 models right now. This data set is small, so it's fast. If your model takes an hour to train, then you need to get some coffee. You can actually run this over multiple cores. Most of the models in scikit-learn kind of work only in a single core, so I could do n jobs equal to 3 and use 3 cores and parallelize over the cores. And you can see here in the output, so I try this C and this gamma, and you can see this happened 5 times for each iteration in the cross-validation, and here's the scores, and they're really bad. Then here, after doing the 5 iterations, it goes to the next gamma value, and then goes to the next gamma value, and so on, and then it goes to the next C value, and tries all the gamma values, and so on. Okay, so now fit built a model, and now I can use predict. So this gives me the predictions on the test set of the model built on the whole training set with the best parameters found using cross-validation. Or I can use score, and I see, wait, this was a digits data set, right? Yes, it was a digits data set. And you can see that actually SVM does pretty good on the digits data set with 99.1% accuracy. And so this grid search object handles all of these things for you internally, and you can just do fit and predict as you would do with any other model. If you want to understand more what's going on, there are some attributes that you can look at. So I think it's the first time we're looking at attributes. In scikit-learn, all of the attributes that are like learned from the data in some sense end with a trailing underscore. So if you look at the attributes of grid search, so I do tab for autocompletion, and so you can see some of them have a trailing underscore. Those are the things that are estimated from data in some way, and there's some that don't. The ones that don't have a trailing underscore, these are constructor parameters that I passed in, basically. So CV here will be just the 5 that I passed in, and estimator will just be the SVC that I passed in, but the things with the underscore are things that were learned. So I can look at the best params. This is the best combination of parameters found in cross-validation. So C equal to 1, gamma equal to 0.001. I can look at the best score. This is the best cross-validation score. So again, this is not the same as this. This is sort of a common confusion. So using this best score is helpful for selecting the model if you have different models you want to try. But again, because you tried many different models, this best score might be overly optimistic. So evaluating on a separate test set will actually give you an unbiased estimate of how I'll do in the future. So here you can see they're pretty close. Actually, the test set score is better. So, but this basically you want to run only once at the end. At the best score, you can look at it often as you want while you're iterating on building your model. Yes, so, okay. Give me 2 minutes, okay? So the other thing is, so you don't, before we go to the answer of this question, I want to look at one more attribute, which is best estimator. Best estimator actually gives you the trained model that was trained on the whole data set with the best parameters. If you want to just do prediction or scoring, you don't need to look at this. You could just do like predict or score directly on grid search. But if you want to introspect the model, so often you want to look at the coefficients of the model or, I don't know, the feature importances of the model. If you want to get the actual model object, you can look at best estimator. The SVC, for example, has something like support vectors. If you want to find out what the support vectors are, you can look here. So this is really, you only need to look at best estimator if you want to do some model introspection. All right, so that was a very good question, which is, what is the parameters? The best parameters are on the edge of the search range. We probably should extend the search range if they're on the edge of the search range, right? So, but how do we figure this out? So I would usually visualize the results. So in particular, the mean test scores. There is an attribute called CV results. That's a dictionary. If you want, you can transform it to a data frame that makes it a little bit easier to handle. Here right now, I just look at the mean test scores. And I reshape this and plot it and label it. And you can see this is the result of the cross-validation. And you can see that out here, it's basically chance performance. So 10% correct, which is really bad. And here it's like high 90s correct. And so you could think about, okay, maybe I shouldn't have searched over here. And maybe I want to extend the search range here. But actually, the optimum value was here, which is pretty much in the center. And there doesn't seem to be a lot going on here. So I'm pretty happy with this. But yeah, you should try to visualize the scores to see if your search ranges were reasonable. And so this is the mean cross-validated accuracy from the cross-validation. And so I would look at this before I look at the test score usually to see, was my grid good? If my grid was bad, pick a different grid, run a different grid, look at the outcomes. And once I'm happy with all of this, then I run the test set. All right, so now as a 10-minute exercise, I want you to use grid search CV and adjust n neighbors of the k neighbors classifier. And you can do it on digits or an iris, whatever you want. And you can actually, if you want, you can also, there's not only mean test score, you can also get the mean training score. So you can plot how training test score behave differently, if you're interested. Okay, who's still working on this? Anyone still working on this? Okay, I think we got to move on. So just to quickly run through the solution. So here, I set the param grid. The key is n neighbors. It's the parameter name in the model. And I give it a list. It should try 1, 3, 5, 7, and 10. I instantiate grid search CV within the k neighbors classifier. The parameter grid, oh, actually, because I want to compute the training score and plot it, I also gave it return train score equal to true. Then I fit the model. I get the best parameters. I get the training set score, the test set score, and then I'm plotting the results. So here, results is CV results, and here I'm just plotting the number of neighbors against the mean training score and the number of neighbors against the mean test score. So here, the training set accuracy, so the best number of neighbors is 1. In this case, the training set accuracy is 1, and the test set accuracy is 0.98. And you can see here the training set error and the test set error. Wait, I'm doing this on the digits data set, so these might sort of be meaningful. If you do this but the results will change if you split into training and test set differently. And if you do it on the iris data set, they will usually be much more noisy. Here, okay, we can, so it might be interesting to look at the standard deviation of these, but here, given at least these plots, you can see very clearly one neighbor is the best on this data set. And actually does like reasonably well with 98.4% accuracy. So like the simplest machine learning model you could think of does near perfectly on this data set. So it's pretty simple. But this is like, if your this algorithm, nearest neighbors, might take a long time to run if your data set is very big because it computes all pairwise distances. But if your data set is reasonably small, this is a good sanity check, like, or baseline, to just run and see what this spits out. Whatever solution you come up with should be better than this. Okay, questions about this? Nope. All right, so next I want to talk a little bit more about preprocessing. So if you come from a different language like R, that does a lot of preprocessing for you. In scikit-learn, you need to be very explicit about the preprocessing you want to do. So here is another example. So someone over there will be angry at me for using a different data set. So this is a data set of house prices. So here what you can see is each of these scatter plots will corresponds to a feature, and the y-axis in all of them is house price. This is actually house prices in Boston, but I think in the 70s. So they're like at maximum 50K for a house. Or I think apartments. And so there are, the different features here are crime rate, industrialization, whether you're on the river, nitrogen dioxide concentration, different tax rate, ages of houses, number of rooms in the house, and things like that. And so the goal here is to predict the price of the house. And so if you look at this, so this is a regression problem where we try to predict the continuous variable. And so if you look at these plots, they already tell you a lot about this data set. So for example, the number of rooms seems to be pretty strongly correlated with the price, which makes sense. I forgot what else that is, but this also seems very highly correlated, whereas some things like this don't look very correlated. I think actually the original paper where this comes from was to say that the racial makeup of the neighborhood doesn't influence price. And I think it's this one. Anyway, so you can see some of these are very correlated, others are not. Some look linearly correlated, some look like there's not a linear relationship. But another thing you can look at is the ranges of these different features. So here, the Charleston River variable is just whether it's 0 if you're not on the river, it's 1 if you're on the river. So it's just 0 or 1. It's a categorical, actually. This nitrogen dioxide concentration is between like 0.3 and 0.9. And the tax here is between like 100 and 800. So these are very different orders of magnitude. And for example, for the nearest neighbor classifier, this would be a big problem. Let me see if I have, yeah. So here you can see more clearly in this box plot the distribution of all of these. So here I don't, the Y label is wrong. Give me one sec. So the Y label is just how often it appears. It's just the value for each of these. It's not the target. And so you can see that the tax is much, much higher than the others. Like here, this nitrogen dioxide, which is between 0 and 1 mostly, it's like a very different distribution from these others. And so if you, let's say you try to use a nearest neighbor algorithm on this. Oh wait, do I have a picture on this? No, that's unfortunate. So if I use a nearest neighbor algorithm on this, then it will basically only look at the tax rate, because the distance in the tax rate, or in the taxes, will be measured in the hundreds. So if you're a little bit away in the taxes, so if you're like, the distance from here to here is like not that much, but it's 100 units. It's a distance of 100. So this will mean they are very dissimilar in Euclidean distance. Whereas if something in this variable is completely different, it's a difference from 0 and 1. So the total distance will be very small. So if you just ran nearest neighbor on this, it will work very badly, because it will only use the taxes and will basically ignore everything else, because the taxes have a bigger magnitude. And so this is where scaling becomes important. So we can scale this so that they all are on the same order of magnitude, and then things like a nearest neighbor algorithm will work better. So here, give me one sec. Okay. And so if you want to, so the same is true for other models, like Rich is a linear model that also works better with scaling usually. And so here I load this Boston data set, this also in scikit-learn, do a train test split. I scale it with a standard scaler, we already saw that. I fit it on the training data set. Then I transform the training data set. So I remove mean and variance. There's a typo in this. Wow. Sorry about that. So this should be scalar.transform. So I get X-train scaled. Then I can fit this rich model, which is a regression model, on the scaled data and the targets Y. And I can transform the test set and then score the scale test set, and I get a result. And this is actually better than if you don't scale it. This is sort of the standard pre-processing workflow. You fit it on a training set, you transform a training set, and you transform a test set. Maybe to drive home again the point that I made earlier about the scaling of the data. So I emphasize that you want to train the training and test data set in a consistent way. So here, actually I used so there's a different data set. It's like I used a different scalar between 0 and 1. So the min-max scalar between 0 and 1. So let's say I have my original data set here, one feature here, one feature there. In blue is the training data set, and the rest is a test set. If I now compute the minimum and maximum on the training data set, and then I transform the training data set with the same minimum and maximum, and the test set with the same minimum and maximum, I get this. So here you can see now the pictures are identical, and 1.0 is here, 0 is here, 0 is here, 1.0 is here. So I put everything in this box by using the min-max scalar. So if I would, instead of transforming the test data set with the statistics from the training set, if I compute if I fit again on the test data set, or if I use like something like the scale function that just does the scaling on the same set, then I get something like this. So here, if I fit on both the training and the test data set, like individually, you can see the training data set in blue looks exactly the same. But now the test data set in red moved around, because now I made the maximum in the test set be 0 and 1. So now, here the red triangles go from 0 to 1 on this axis and 0 to 1 on this axis. But that means they got stretched relative to the training data set. And so what they mean, the meaning of the data, was not preserved. So if you refit your transformation, even the preprocessing, on the test data set, you will distort the statistics between training and test data set. And so don't do that. You should always call fit only on the training set. All right, so that was sort of scaling. Another thing that's very important is categorical features. So they come up quite a lot in data science applications. So so far everything was continuous, and we wanted floating point numbers. But often you have some categorical variable that could be like red, green, blue, or male, female, or anything like that, age groups, whatever you want. And these are not floating point numbers. The easiest way you could encode this is just give every one of these an integer, like say red is 0, green is 1, blue is 2. But that's not very good because it imposes an order on these categories that is probably not semantic. Also, it limits what the model can express, because that would mean that green lies between red and blue, which is not true. So a better way to encode this is to use what's called one-hot encoding or dummy variables. So here, for each possible value of a categorical variable, I add a new feature that will be binary. So I had one categorical variable with 3 possible values, red, green, and blue. And I added 3 new features. The one says the value is red, the other one says the value is green, the other one says the value is blue. And so exactly one of them will be 1, and the others will be 0. And this is sort of a very flexible way to express categorical variables in a way that works for all machine learning models. If there's any statisticians in the audience, they will tell me, well, but you don't actually need the last column. If you know that red is 0 and green is 0, you know that blue is 1. And if you know that red is 1 or green is 1, you know that blue is 0. So you could actually drop the last column, and not dropping it might introduce collinearities in your model. But I'd say don't worry about that. And I find that often the model is more interpretable if you keep the columns for each of the features. But that's sort of a matter of taste. All right, so let's go through these 2 preprocessing steps. So here I'm loading this Boston data set. Again, this is like a very small toy data set. So I do load Boston. I import train test split and split into train and test set. Here, if you're interested, you can look at the description. PT ratio is pupil-teacher ratio. Yeah, look at the where this data comes from. Oops. Here's the plot that I showed earlier, just sort of to get you familiar with the data a little bit. This was where the label was wrong, so I removed it. Okay, so let's start with the scaling. So here I'm going to use the k-neighbors regressor for this example because it shows the difference much, much more. So I have the standard scaler here. I scale my training data set. And now I use cross-value score on the training set. Oh, this is the original data set, xtrain, without scaling. And now I run the same cross-validation with scaling. And you can see that, so here the scores are now R squared because it's a regression data set. And you can see that the scores went from 0.5 to 0.75 if I scale the data. So scaling helped us model a lot. As I said, for tree-based models, scaling doesn't matter. So here, I'm doing the same thing with the random forest classifier. And so you can see it didn't really change anything. So there's like, I guess, some tie breaks kind of changed. And so you can see that they're not 100% the same thing, but they're pretty much the same thing. So tree-based models don't care at all. So you shouldn't scale for tree-based models, basically. But for all other models, it's usually quite important. There's one caveat in what I did here. So I actually did a bad thing. And I'll later tell you how to fix that. But the bad thing I did is I scaled the data before putting it into cross-validation. That means I looked at all the data, all the folds, and scaled them all. And then I put it in cross-validation. Cross-validation split it up into the different folds. That means that I actually used the validation folds also to scale the data, which is bad, and I shouldn't have done. But to do that in a better way, we'll see probably like in the next section. But yeah, so you can see, depending on the model, scaling might make quite a dramatic difference in the outcome. All right, so the other thing I wanted to talk about is categorical variables. So if you work with categorical variables, actually working with pandas is much, much easier than working with NumPy arrays. So, and usually you load your data from like a CSV or Excel file or database, and you have this in pandas. And I misspell Manhattan all the time. So let's say you have some data about users, like how much they make, and which borough of Manhattan they live in, so which borough of New York they live in, and you have that as a pandas data frame. And so now here, there's two variables. One is a salary, which is a continuous variable, and the other one is to borrow, which is a categorical variable. So there's like 5 possibilities, and it's going to be one of these 5. And so in pandas, you can get these dummy variables by calling pandas.getDummies. And you can see here, pandas automatically figures out which variables are categorical and creates a new column for each of these. So here, these are now called borough Bronx, borough Brooklyn, borough Manhattan, borough Queens. And the salary stayed the same. So that's very convenient. Sometimes someone was very helpful and pre-processed the data so that the categorical is actually encoded as integers. So here's the same data, but instead of having the borrows be the strings, they're just 0 to 3. If I now call getDummies, actually nothing happens. Because pandas only converts rows with getDummies by default that are objects, so that's mostly strings, or that are pandas categorical, which is like in pandas internal type for categorical variables. Before, these were just strings, so it encoded them using dummy variables. Now the integer is not encoded. If I want to force it to encode the integers, or if I want to force it to not encode particular columns, I can explicitly say which columns to do dummy encoding with. So now, if I do columns equal to borrow, again, it will do the expansion for this particular column and assume that each integer value is a different category. All right, so far so good. Okay, I just see, so they changed, let's see if this still works, because they changed something in pandas, and it looks like I haven't updated this. But So the problem with this is there's actually not 4 boroughs. As you might know, there's 5. And so if someone gives me now a new data set where there's a different subset of 4 boroughs. Let's say someone gives me, so this was my training set, I built a model, and now I have a test set, and someone gives it to me, and the Bronx is not in there, but Staten Island is in there. And then you will again have 4 columns, but one of the columns will have changed their semantics, and your model will produce garbage. So you want to make sure that the meaning of each column is consistent between the training and the test set. If they are labeled with like if they're labeled in this way, that might be easy to see, but actually scikit-learn completely discards the labels for right now. I hope to fix that. But so these column names are completely ignored. And so as long as you have 4 features, it will just run through. And so you need to make sure these 4 features correspond to the same semantic thing. So one way to do this is to use pandas categorical variables. And let's see if this still, okay. This is deprecated, so you can use, okay, let me actually do the new one. I think this should work. Yes. Okay. So this is the new way to do it. So I can make the borough column categorical, and I can say what are the categories, because I know what the possible values are. So I know the possible values are these 5, and now for this categorical variable, if I gave the categories, they will always be encoded in a consistent way. So now if I call getDummies, it will actually create columns for all the possible values in the order that I gave them here, and even if they don't appear. So if I do this, then this will ensure the features have the same semantics, both in training and test set. So this is like a little bit of I'm not sure if this is the nicest syntax, but so with the PD categorical, you can create basically a categorical column. And so this basically, these are not strings anymore, these are pandas categoricals. And these are always encoded in the same way. All right, so as an exercise, what I want you to do is to apply dummy encoding and scaling to the adult data set that was in the repository. So this is actually like a somewhat more interesting realistic data set that's bigger than the data sets we looked at so far. This is from the adult census from, I think, 1990. And so, and it's like a CSV file, which is how you often would get this kind of data. Maybe one slight caveat is that right now it's kind of tricky to not scale the one-hot encoded columns. So you can do the dummy encoding first and then scale the data. Maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense to scale the 0s and 1s, but it also doesn't matter that much. So don't worry about that too much. Just do first the dummy encoding and then scale the data. And yeah, and I'll give you like 10 minutes for this, and if you get bored, you can do some visualization, exploration of the data, which is quite interesting and very depressing. So this is this is a classification data set where the task is to predict whether someone has makes more than 50K or less than 50K, which was like upper middle class when this data set was generated, I guess, like rich people. maybe as I see some people are petering out already, just the plan for the rest of the day. So there's going to be a second session here in the afternoon. And basically, I'm just going to go as far as I get with these notebooks. And then I'm just going to continue wherever I ended up, wherever I stopped in the afternoon. There's a second repository with like the advanced notes, and I'll get to that once we finished all of these notebooks in here. But we're not going to get through all of the introductory now. Was there anything else I wanted to say? Oh yeah, and I think some people didn't realize. So the book signing tomorrow, we're giving away like 15 free books. What kind? What time? Oh, I don't know. It's in the afternoon. It's at the career fair. Whenever, I don't have a good program. Maybe I should get a paper program. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at the adult data set. So what I did here, maybe I should have said this more explicitly. So I loaded the data set. If you look at head, you can see this is just sort of what a data set looked like once you loaded it. And you can see like age, work class, education. Education is encoded again as a numerical. Marital status, occupation, relationship, race, gender, capital gains, capital losses, work hours per week, where they come from, and income. And this is a categorical here. So, sorry? Well, yeah, they could be categorical. So, I mean, hours per week, I kind of know that they're continuous, right? What I mean by that is that working 41 hours is very similar to working 40 hours. So I should treat them similarly, which means it's a categorical. Like there's a continuum of numbers. For the education num, so the idea is here, this could be, this is exactly the same variable as education. Whoever curated this data set thought it might be helpful to have the education encoded as a categorical variable, which is this column, and as a continuous variable, which is this column. So here, this is supposed to be like a ranking variable telling you like how far along do you get in your education, where a higher number means more education. Okay. So I didn't tell you that explicitly, maybe I should, but so the target is income, and so you want to separate out the target before you do any pre-processing. You don't want to rescale this or one-hot encode it or anything like that. So we take out the income, then data features will be all the columns except for the income, which I can get by data.drop income. So now I get this guy here. This is the same data set, but now the income column is dropped. So this will be my X after I pre-process it. So now I can do get dummies. I call data one hot, so because that is one hot encoding or dummy encoding. And then I split it with train test split. Here I choose to use min-max scalar. You could use standard scalar or robot scalar or whatever. And then I look at the shape. So now I didn't show all the columns because there's many, many columns. And so here there's 24,000 rows. And now after the expansion, there's 107 columns. So before we had like 13 columns. And the 13 columns got expanded to 107 columns with, because there's a lot of different occupations and there's a lot of different countries where people come from. So it really explodes our feature space quite a bit. Oh, here I also plotted the categorical variables, the continuous variables using a pair plot to see if there's anything interesting. Something that's interesting is, so here orange is less than 50K and blue is more than 50K. you can see that more education makes you richer, or makes you gain more capital gain. So people get more capital gain when they do more. So this is capital gain on like investments. Also, more capital loss means you're richer, because basically only rich people do investing. Like if you like live hand to mouth, then you're not going to buy stock. Interestingly, yeah, and so here you can see age maybe also has a positive correlation. Anyway, so much for that. So now I want to talk a little bit more about specific classes of models. We only looked at the nearest neighbor so far. Now I want to look at linear models, trees, and random forests, because these are some of the most important models. So the nearest neighbor model is more like something that's easy to understand, but it's not really used that much in practice. Linear models and tree-based models are very commonly used. So I want to dive into a little bit about linear models. And so we're not only going to get through this for regression, I think, before lunch, and I really encourage you to come back after lunch, and because these are very important models. So what are linear models for regression? So here's a 1D example where I have on the x-axis a single input feature, on the y-axis a thing that I want to predict. A linear model in this case is just trying to fit a line to these points to predict the outcome. So here, for example, the green line. They're called linear models, not because they're linear in the input space, which they are, but because they're linear in the parameters. So they're always computed in any dimension as some inner product between parameters that you want to find w and the data x, plus some offset or bias. So that means that here, if p is the number of features, for each feature I have a w which weights each feature, either positively or negatively, and then I have an offset b, and this will be my prediction. So this is the prediction formula for all linear models. Like, you could also use some function of xi if you wanted to, but basically this is sort of the general formula we'll be looking at. And there's many, many different linear models, and they all predict in the same way, but they're different in how they find this w and b. And so learning here figuring out what are the w's and the b's. The simplest one of these is ordinary least squares, or sometimes called just linear regression. In scikit-learn, it's just linear regression. And so here you have the same prediction formula as all linear models, and the way that you find the parameters. I forgot the b here, but imagine there a b being here. Or you could get rid of the b by just adding a constant one feature to your data. Then you don't need the b. Okay, so how do I find these parameters? So the simplest thing is a least squares estimate. So I just say the prediction that my model makes, so w transpose xi, should be close to yi in Euclidean distance, or in least squares sense. So I square this and I sum them all up. So that's like Gaussian quadrature or something? No, Gaussian least squares thing. And this is sort of the simplest thing you can do. You measure the error of prediction with least squares. And then you want to find w. And this is a very simple problem to solve. And it has a unique solution if the matrix X has full rank. Full column rank. So basically it says, fit the training set as best as possible. This doesn't really allow you this control of complexity that we talked about before. This just tries to fit the training set as best as possible. This is because linear models are sort of not very flexible in lower dimensions. this is already sort of a restricted model, so maybe it works even though you don't force it to be simple, because it's sort of simple by nature. But in higher dimensions, in particular, if you have more features than samples, which can happen in many settings, this will not have full rank, this will not have a unique solution, and you will also overfit your training data tremendously. Because if you have more features than samples, usually there's multiple solutions that will give you zero error, but they will all overfit your training data. So what we can do is add what's called a penalty or regularizer, which means I force the model to be simple. In this case here, simple means I want the coefficients W to be small. So I not only want to predict well on the training data set, I want to predict well on the training data set while keeping a W as small as possible. And again, I'm using least squares or the L2 norm to say what small means. And then I need to specify how much do I care about being good on the training set versus making W small. So basically, meaning W small means how I want a small slope in as many features as possible. So I wanted the target to depend as little as possible on the input while still making good predictions. So this is kind of a sensible way of saying I want a simple model. But I have this free parameter alpha that I need to set that basically says what's the trade-off between trying to fit the model and trying to keep the model simple. And that's exactly this model complexity parameter that we talked about earlier. And so this, again, we need to set via grid search and cross-validation. Luckily, this always has a unique solution, and it makes sense to solve this even if you have more features than samples. So let's try this. Why did I import shuffle? Okay. So here I'm importing two different linear models, ridge and linear regression. Again, as I said, linear regression is the unpenalized version where you're just trying to fit the training set. Ridge is where you're also penalized. I import cross-vault score, load the Boston housing data set that we already know. Well, if you forget about it, this is what it looks like. And so here, we have 506 data points and 13 features. So here, actually, because there's sort of an order of magnitude more samples than features, maybe we don't need to regularize, maybe linear regression will do fine. But so that would sort of be my prior thought. This is probably low dimensional enough that linear regression will not overfit terribly. And so here do a train test split and do a cross-validation on a training set, and I get an R-square of 0.71. If I do a ridge regression, I also get an R-square of 0.71. It's like a tiny bit worse, but probably not really. This is with the default parameter alpha equal to 1. So people asked me before, so do I need to scale data for linear models? And the answer is, at least in theory, for linear regression, you don't need to scale the data. For ridge regression, you should scale the data. Because this penalty that you put on the coefficients, if you don't scale the data, it means something different for each of the coefficients, and you don't want that. Yes, linear regression, you don't have to, you should. In linear regression, you might still want to do it for numeric stability reasons, but like, apart from sort of the numeric details, it shouldn't matter. So now we can run grid searching here and try to fit the alpha parameter. This alpha parameter is best found on the log space. It's usually what you search for any of the regularization parameters of models. So here I do grid search with ridge, parameter grid, and tenfold cross-validation. I fit on a training set. It should all be sort of familiar for you. I look at the results, and then I plot them. And I think this time I plot them with pandas because it's kind of nice. And then I see I shouldn't have done this. Give me 1 second. I just restart my kernel to have smaller plots. Why is this not smaller? Anyway. Okay. So here you can see that basically making alpha very, very small gives the best results. And then both training and test set error go down if I make alpha bigger. So this means that basically doing linear regression without any penalty is best. It's not overfitting at all. And if I add penalty, the more penalty I add, the worse it is. So here on the very left-hand side, this is basically the same as doing linear regression, having a very small alpha. Okay, so here ridge didn't really work. So to illustrate how ridge might work, I'm actually now going to expand the feature space and add many more features, so to maybe get a better model, but also show you how regularization might help. What I'm going to do now is I'm using polynomial features, which means I will, for each feature that is there, I will add not only this feature, but also this feature squared. And for each pair of features, I will also add the interaction term. That means I take feature 1 and feature 2, and I take the product of both of them. So this means I will have many more features now. So here, for simplicity, I'm not doing things properly and scaling on the whole data set, which I told you not to do. But I didn't want to, like, you can do this properly, but I haven't introduced these concepts yet. So here, doing these polynomial features, I now get 104 features, which include all these like features squared and all the products of two features. Now, if I do linear regression, I actually, is that? Okay, yeah, this is the polynomial expansion. It's better than it was before, I think. It's now 80, not 71. If I use ridge, it's even better. It's 82. I can run my grid search again now and look at the plot. And now the plot looks quite different. Now it looks basically like the cartoon I showed earlier. So here, the left is little regularization, the right is more regularization. And so left are very complicated models, right are very simple models. And you can see that if you make the model more complicated, obviously the training set error is higher, but the test set error is lower. And here there's some sweet spot about alpha equal to 10 that gives me the best results. Okay, best alpha is actually 14 and gives me a result of about 0.86. So another thing that's nice about regularization is, so as I said before, this linear regression can be a little bit numerically unstable. So here is the coefficients of this linear regression model. So I didn't scale the data, which makes it possibly worse, but also linear regression, how well it works really depends on the rank of the matrix. And so you can see here, there's, it looks like two features are the only important ones, and the others are not. So these are the 140 or something features. How many? 104 features. And I colored them blue if they're positive and red if they're negative. And so these are the W's. And it looks like one is really small and one is big and the rest is 0. But if you look closer, you see that these are really big. So this is a 1 with 12 zeros. So this is not really what you want to see in your model. You have like one, I don't know what is that, this one being a trillion, this one being minus 3 trillion, or I don't know if it's trillion. So this is not really a very stable model where you have these giant coefficients. Now, if I want to look at the coefficients for ridge, oh, I haven't shown this here really. So coefficients are in the coef attribute, again with the trailing underscore. So coef with the trailing underscore is the W matrix, or the W vector. I can also look at the same thing for ridge. So here I'm looking at, because I want to look at the ridge model that was the result of the grid search, I'm looking at grid.bestestimator underscore. So this is the ridge model that was fit with the best parameters. And then I look at the coefficients again. And these are the coefficients. So this model performs better, but also looks much more reasonable. So here the coefficients are now actually between minus 3 and 3 without 12 zeros. And you can see that actually many of these features are important. The reason why this happens is that probably these two features are highly correlated. So maybe this is the product of this feature with something else. And so if they're correlated, one of them coefficients can become very large, the other one very small, and they basically cancel each other out. The ridge model prevents this from happening by shrinking everything towards 0. You can also look at what effect the settings of alpha have on the parameters. So here I have the default alpha of 1 printed in blue, the best parameter setting of alpha equal to 14 in orange, and a higher alpha setting in 100 in green. And you can basically see that it squeezes the coefficients towards 0. So here you can always see the blue point, the orange point, and then the green point. And sort of usually they will just sort of be more and more towards 0. There's also some cases which are kind of interesting where the coefficient changes the sign when you change the regularization. And what it tells me is that you should be very careful if you're trying to look at these coefficients and interpret them, because particularly if you're using regularization, it's very hard. I mean, also if you're not using regularization, it's very hard to interpret really what these coefficients might mean. But it's often like still useful to look at a model. There's another other model that I want to just very briefly mention, which is called the lasso model, which I don't have in the slides for some reason. The lasso model works very similar, but instead of using L2 regularization, it uses L1 regularization for penalizing the weights. So it uses absolute values. And what the effect of this means that it will automatically pick a subset of the features that will have coefficients non-equal to 0. So many of the coefficients will be equal to 0. Again, you have a parameter alpha that shrinks everything towards 0. But while in ridge, everything sort of is slowly shrunking towards 0. In ridge, nothing will ever be exactly 0. The way that lasso is formulated, some coefficients will actually be exactly 0. So here, using the default alpha of 1, this is our test set score, and it uses only 9 features. So I probably want to have a smaller alpha, and gets better, and uses more features. But so you can use this if you want a small interpretable model. Lasso might be nicer. Yeah? I mean, so if you want to like apply the model, you can use predict to forecast, right? I mean, the model itself still takes the full 104 feature vectors, features, but it's just going to use 9 of them. And if you want to know which 9, then you can look at the coefficient vector or at where's the coefficient vector 0. Like this tells you, this used the first couple features, it didn't use these features, and so on. Wait, sorry. Yes, you're right. Okay, now true are the ones that are used. I'm not sure if I understand the question. I mean, to apply this model to any data set, you just always use predict. If you want to do dimensionality reduction, if you want to select features based on this and then train a different model, that's a different story. But if you just want to use this linear model to make any predictions, just call predict. All right, so now for the last 15 minutes, I want you to load the diabetes data set and apply linear regression, ridge, and lasso, visualize the coefficients, and possibly also try, can you improve if you use polynomial features? And how does this change which of the models is best? And so after this, it's going to be lunch break, and then I think at 1, I'm going to be back here. You're the volunteer. You can... It's 2? Okay, we're back at 2. That's good. Well, oh, yeah, it's 1 now, so we're back at 2. All right. Thanks, everybody.